Good evening, everyone. I'm Jane Elder, and I'm the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters, and I'd like to welcome you all to the fifth talk in our American Dream in Wisconsin series, which is exploring how health, happiness, education, and the immigrant experience are shaping our hopes and dreams for the future. The final talk in this series will be on April 10th with Michael Johnson of the Boys and Girls Club of Dane County, and he'll be talking about youth and the leadership needed in achieving the American dream in Wisconsin today. And just a note of clarification for some of those who have asked, the flyer that you might have been handed as you came in the doors on State Street this evening is not something produced by the Wisconsin Academy, and something that if you took voluntarily, that's fine, but it is not in any way associated with our event tonight. Just wanted to make that note clear. At the Wisconsin Academy, we bring people together at the intersection of the sciences, arts, and letters to inspire discovery, illuminate creative work, and foster civil dialogue on important issues. Our programs and publications explore, explain, and sustain Wisconsin thought and culture, and we're always working to improve life in Wisconsin by sharing great ideas, and many people make this work possible. I want to thank Wisconsin Academy members and donors for their ongoing support, as well as the following American Dream in Wisconsin series partners: the University of Wisconsin Extension, UW-Madison School of Education and Department of Continuing Studies and University Research Park, National Guardian Life Insurance, Reinert Borner Van Duren, American Family Insurance Dream Bank, Trust Point, and Quarles and Brady. We also appreciate the support of lead media sponsor Isthmus Publishing and the broadcast support of Wisconsin Eye, who is recording our series talks and sharing them with Wisconsin and the world via Facebook Live. These talks would not happen without the critical support of the Great Performance Fund at the Madison Community Foundation and its generous donors who make our programming at Overture Center possible. I also want to acknowledge the generosity of Johnson Bank for providing support for us to be in Capitol Theater tonight. And so the 1,000+ seats we're able to offer you this evening, they have helped us be here. Finally, I want to invite everyone here tonight to consider becoming a member of the Wisconsin Academy. By joining the Academy, we're able to connect you with fascinating people and great ideas across the sciences, arts, and letters. And you become part of a community of lifelong learners who value critical thinking, curiosity, excellence, and inclusivity. So if you enjoy tonight's talk and would like to help us use the power of ideas to improve life in Wisconsin, let me encourage you to become a member of the Academy. Academy staff will be available in the lobby following the talk to help answer your questions. You will also notice, you truly will, the donation box is in the lobby. We are really pleased to provide tonight's program free of charge to the public, but to support programs like these, let me ask that as you leave tonight, you consider a voluntary donation at the door to help support these thoughtful and insightful conversations, and I thank you in advance. Before we begin tonight, this is your moment to silence any electronic devices you might have with you. Tonight, we're very honored to present a conversation between Wisconsin Academy Fellow Dr. Richard Davidson, the founder of Healthy Minds Innovations and UW-Madison Vilas Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry, and Anne Strainchamps, the host and co-founder of Wisconsin Public Radio's To the Best of Our Knowledge. Dr. Davidson is best known for his groundbreaking work studying emotion and the brain, and for leading conversations on well-being on international stages such as the World Economic Forum, where he serves on the Global Council of Mental Health. This has prompted such honors as Time magazine naming Davidson one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2006. His research is broadly focused on the neural basis of emotion and emotional style, as well as methods to promote human flourishing, including meditation and related contemplative practices. His studies have centered on people across the lifespan from birth through old age. He's conducted studies with individuals with emotional disorders, such as mood and anxiety disorders and autism, as well as expert meditation practitioners with tens of thousands of hours of experience. His research uses a wide range of methods and has led to the publication of hundreds of scientific papers, numerous chapters and reviews, and most recently, the release of Altered Traits: Science Reveals How Meditation Changes Your Mind, Brain, and Body, co-authored with Daniel Goleman. This book will be available for sale in the lobby following tonight's talk. We look forward to the thoughtful conversation that will unfold between Dr. Davidson and Ms. Strainchamps as they explore tonight's topic, the pursuit of happiness. Around 8 p.m., we'll shift to questions from the audience, and we'll plan to wrap up no later than 8:30 p.m. Audience members watching through Facebook Live can join the discussion using hashtag AmericanDreamWI or email questions@Wisconsin Academy. Again, that's hashtag AmericanDreamWI or email questions@wisconsinacademy.org. And now, please help me give a warm welcome to Richard Davidson and Annie Strainchamps. Thanks.
Wow, full house. This is exciting. Richie, welcome. It's such a pleasure to see you.
Great to be here.
You're just back from Dharamsala.
I am. Had a wonderful week there.
Talking with the Dalai Lama?
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
hopefully you've brought a little bit of grace you can spread amongst us.
A little bit.
So I just like to start by just getting to know the audience just a little bit. So I'm just curious, how many people here would like to feel a little more happiness in your everyday life? Okay. Not that many people felt like, no thanks, I've got plenty. Any more happiness would choke me. No. Okay, and then how many people, you could clap this time so we can hear, how many of you have in the last week done something, let's say, that you thought would make you happier, but didn't? Okay, so Richie, we've got a room full of people who would like to be happier, who frequently do things that they hope will make them happier, but that don't quite. So clearly we could all use some expertise. Why don't we start by talking about what happiness actually is?
Well, I think happiness has to do with human flourishing and with basically a disposition that enables us to be as good as we can be and to utilize all of the capacities that we have been endowed with. And one of the really amazing insights that we can glean from modern research is that there is what we call an innate basic goodness, that we're all born with a propensity to be happy, to be free of suffering, and also to prefer cooperative, warm-hearted kinds of interactions.
It's so interesting. I asked about happiness and feeling happiness, and you went straight to virtue. You talked about goodness. I feel like those are different things.
Well, you know, one of the most powerful ways of promoting happiness is to be good. And that's really one of the messages that the Dalai Lama has been promoting. And it turns out that there's actually now a substantial body of research which is showing that that is true. For example, if we bring, there are these crazy social psychological studies that have been done. If we bring people into the laboratory in the morning and give them $100 and say to them, you can take this money, and we know that people often want to buy things for themselves, but they consider it frivolous. Here's $100, and you can go buy whatever you like for the $100, but the only constraint is that you can only buy stuff for yourself, and then come to the lab at the end of the day. And another group is given, and these are randomly assigned, another group is given the same $100, and they're told, please, we know that people have always wanted to buy little gifts for other people, but may not have been able to afford it or haven't had the time. This is an opportunity for you to take this $100 and buy gifts for other people. The only constraint is you can't spend a penny on yourself. And they bring them back to the lab at the end of the day, and guess which group reports tremendously increased happiness compared to the other? So there are many studies of that kind. There's a whole genre of psychological studies, and it suggests that being good and being happy are highly correlated.
Okay, what about joy? What about just the feeling state that we think of as just bliss, transcendent, it's a beautiful day, I'm standing at the top of a mountain looking at a gorgeous view, everything feels right with my world.
Well, when we
more?
think about happiness, we prefer to use the term well-being.
It sounds so tame compared to joy.
Well, it's because it's not about being happy all the time. I just got back from a week with the Dalai Lama, and one of the things that I've really have had the honor of being able to see is the Dalai Lama up close. And as a long-term student of emotion, he is really the most unusual person I've ever encountered on the planet in terms of his emotions. And he has the largest dynamic range of emotion of any human being I've ever seen. And he's not happy all the time. But I would say that he has enduring well-being that's constant. But if he is told about a tragic situation, he'll start to cry. And he'll show sadness. But that's not incompatible with well-being. And so the book that Dan Goleman and I recently wrote, which was mentioned in the introduction, is called Altered Traits. And what we mean by a trait is a quality that endures. Mm. So if you're transiently happy when it's a beautiful day, that's great, but it's sort of like taking a drug. When it starts to rain, you won't feel happy anymore. And that's not really the point. The point is, how can we have high levels of well-being 24/7?
Well, we live in a nation of people who do take drugs to try to achieve that happy feeling state. But the point, we're trying to make is that there's something much more profound, much deeper, much more lasting.
Yeah, and the social psychologist at Harvard named Dan Gilbert wrote a famous book a few years ago called Stumbling on Happiness. And what the book is about is that we have ideas about what may make us happy, but it turns out a lot of them are really inaccurate. And so we know that material possessions just don't do it. They may produce a transient bump in your happiness, but you come back down to baseline fairly quickly, including in people, and this has been studied, who've won the lottery and won tens of millions of dollars. Beyond a certain minimal level, it turns out that those kinds of material possessions just are not the key ingredients, the key attributes that enable this kind of enduring, what we would call genuine happiness.
So you've spent your career and really created an entire field of science that essentially looks at, investigates a technology for achieving, or at least trying to reach, that deeper state of well-being, and that's meditation. I was hoping we could have a small taste of it just right now, because it's 7 o'clock. Probably a lot of us worked a full day. You're probably still jet lagged. A lot of us have things on our minds, to-do lists. Maybe we did or didn't get dinner. Is there something small we could all do together right now that you could lead us in? Sure.
Just out of curiosity, how many of you do practice some form of meditation at least a couple of times a week? Can you?
Oh, wow.
Many. Wonderful. Well, we can do a little practice. So if you all just put down your pens or whatever you may be holding. And find a good posture to be upright but relaxed. And you can keep your eyes open or closed, whatever is most comfortable. And one of the most important things that we do when we sit down to practice in this way is to check in with our motivation and our intention. Why are we here? Why did you come to this event on happiness? Why do we engage in these practices? And invoking the intention and the motivation that we do these practices not just for ourselves, but that calming our minds and opening our hearts also benefits all of those around us. And so, allowing this motivation to seep in our minds, that sitting in this way is really fundamentally an act of generosity for those we touch. And so let's sit with that intention just for a few moments. And bringing our awareness into our bodies and simply noticing whatever may be present. Sensations that are pleasant, they may be unpleasant, they may be neutral. Bringing our awareness into our bodies and noticing this amazing quality of awareness that we all possess. And noticing our feet on the floor and a sense of groundedness. And now let's just spend a moment reflecting on the notion that all of us share the same wish to be happy and to be free of suffering. This is something that is a universal attribute of all the 7 billion people on this planet. And even if people do things that may seem inappropriate, unjust, that these actions arise from places of confusion, but that at our core, we're all the same in sharing this same wish to be happy and to be free of suffering. And bringing one or two people in mind that you may have come into the theater with, or that you are close to, and simply wishing them happiness and wishing them ease, to be free of suffering. And when you depart this evening, I invite you to simply notice people who you know and notice people who you don't know as you leave, and in your mind, simply send them a silent mental wish. May you be happy. May you be free of suffering. And explore how this simple mental transition impacts your daily interactions. So for those of you who have your eyes closed, you can please open them, and hopefully you have a little taste of the simplicity and the power that these simple practices can have. So thank you.
Richie, that was beautiful. Thank you. I want to ask two questions. One is, as a scientist, what just happened inside each of us personally? And then I also want to know what happens when a room full of people experience that collectively together.
Yeah, those are great questions, Anne. And in terms of the second question, we really don't know. Certainly those of us who have meditated in large groups have the sense that there is this kind of communal energy which can really powerfully facilitate practice. And we do know that group practice can be very important, particularly in early stages of helping a person to just be motivated and to sustain a practice. In terms of what we do know, we know that there are changes that occur in the brain, changes in the body. And one of the amazing things is that it actually doesn't take much to produce change. We see in the scientific literature changes that can occur in as little as 8 minutes of practice in the brain. Now, it doesn't mean that those changes will endure, but it's simply a proof of concept that we can change our brains by transforming our minds, and it's very accessible. It doesn't require tens of thousands of hours of practice. And it may be that you can do this as you're walking around, as you are commuting. We actually don't know the answer to that, whether practicing while you're out and about in the world is as effective as when you're practicing in a more formal way. But it's certainly worth a try. So people who tell us that they have no time, they can't afford another minute, we say, fine, you don't need to take another minute. Do it as you're doing other things. And so it's a way to more seamlessly integrate this into everyday life.
What's actually, you said the brain is changing. The body must be changing too. The brain and the body are all one. So what are the changes that you see, and what's the significance?
We see changes in two major networks in the brain. One network is a network that's important for the regulation of attention. And also a part of that network is a network that is important for what psychologists and neuroscientists have called meta-awareness. And what meta-awareness is monitoring your own mind. So how many people here have had the experience of reading a book where they're actually reading each word, and they're reading one page, another page, and after a few minutes they realize they have no friggin' idea what they just read? Well, at that moment where you realize that you're sort of waking up, that's the monitoring function of the mind. And that is part of this circuit. And that gets strengthened by these practices. And by strengthened, we mean it actually shows increased activation. There's more connectivity between the parts of the brain that comprise this circuit. So that's one. The other circuit that is modulated is a circuit important for the regulation of emotion. And so one of the key ways that we define resilience is this. Resilience is the rapidity with which you recover from adversity. The rapidity with which you recover from adversity. So people that recover more quickly are more resilient. They have higher levels of well-being. And it turns out that we know something about this circuit in the brain that's important for this, and that gets shifted. Now, it doesn't get shifted in just this small amount of practice. So that's the bad news. But the good news is that it actually can change. And we can learn this. These are all learnable skills. And this has led us to the conclusion that happiness and well-being are actually best regarded as skills.
Since there are a lot of people in the room who do already have some kind of meditation practice, and you talked about there's a wide range. You can see some changes in the brain after 8 minutes. You can see more after 5 years of 8 minutes a day. What about for deep meditators, people like yourself? You've probably meditated 10,000 hours in your life.
I probably have. I've actually never done the arithmetic. I'm sure I have, but we've had people coming into the lab who are much, much more experienced, who really are professional meditators, so to speak, and their brains are quite different. We see dramatic differences. We see differences both in the structure of their brain and in the function of their brain. One of the cool findings that is quite recent in the scientific literature is this. Our brains are constantly changing with age. And that's something that's unfortunately not irreversible to the best of our knowledge. But the rate at which the brain changes with age does vary tremendously among people. And it turns out that certain forms of meditation slow the rate at which our brains age.
Wow.
And that's based upon very objective criteria from structural MRI scans. So that's quite interesting. And you also asked about the body. One of the most important shifts that we see in the body is this. We know that chronic inflammation plays a key role in many diseases, including neurological diseases. So most forms of dementia, including Alzheimer's, involve, in addition to the primary lesion, increases in neuroinflammation. And there is good evidence now to suggest that certain forms of meditation are anti-inflammatory. They actually decrease inflammation. They decrease gene expression for genes that are implicated in inflammation. They change cytokines, which are critical in the inflammatory process. So there's a whole cascade of biological changes. And it turns out that the kind of meditation which is most strongly anti-inflammatory are practices which cultivate loving kindness and compassion. They're not mindfulness practices. So the kind of practice that was the second part of what we just did together is the kind of practice that has been found to be most potently anti-inflammatory.
Now that is so interesting, because when the meditation first became more popular in the U.S., it was mindfulness meditation, which John, your friend, old colleague John Kabat-Zinn really promoted and popularized, that's the kind most people, I think, learn first. Have you only recently started studying the loving kindness portion? And would you now say that that's maybe the most important kind to practice?
We've been studying it for quite some time, and I would say that different practices are important for different kinds of changes and for different reasons. And so I wouldn't necessarily say it's the most important kind. I'll tell you what the most important kind of meditation is. So please pay attention to this. And the very best kind of meditation. And that is the kind of meditation that you do.
Of course.
So that really is the most important.
But why would loving kindness meditation produce a different result than some other kind of meditation?
Well, different forms of meditation really do different things. So the notion that meditation, all forms of meditation do the same thing is really, now we can say with confidence, inconsistent with everything we know about the science. They really do different things.
How many kinds are there?
Hundreds.
Hundreds?
Hundreds. It's kind of like sports. It's just a huge variety.
So it's like sports in America can only play baseball and basketball in terms
basically.
of meditation.
And it's, there are certain kinds of, for example, the kind of meditation that the Dalai Lama mostly does has never been studied scientifically, and it's almost, there's very few people in the United States that practice it.
What is it?
It's called analytic meditation, and it's, most people haven't even heard of it. And yet, the Dalai Lama does not do mindfulness meditation.
But what's analytic meditation?
It's it uses thought to analyze, particularly questions about what and where is the mind, and what and where is the self.
Is it more like philosophy? If it's using the mind, is it thinking? I thought meditation wasn't supposed to be thinking.
No, it's certain forms of meditation may directly rely on thinking processes. So you can inquire, and you can ask yourself, where is the self? Does the self have a shape? Is it a specific feeling associated with it? Is it a color? What is the self? Who is this that is engaging in this action? And by asking yourself repeatedly and then resting and noticing whatever comes up, you eventually come to the insight that the self is quite insubstantial. It's not what it's cracked up to be. And when you have that insight, things change. And the grasping at a fixed and solid sense of self, at the very extreme, we have people, for example, with real depression who have this narrative about themselves that's very negative, with low self-worth and self-esteem, and they believe the narrative. They believe that it's a veridical description of who they are, and that can really get us into trouble. And so part of happiness is to change your relationship to the narrative. And one way you can change your relationship to the narrative is through analytic meditation.
So I was just listening to an interview with Charles Raison, who's here at the UW-Madison, who's doing work on depression and well-being and inflammation, and said something I had never heard before, that inflammation in the body is related to and can in many cases produce depression. So that suggests, you were saying that loving kindness meditation can also reduce inflammation, suggests loving kindness meditation can also, or meditation can be a powerful treatment for depression?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's actually a fairly robust scientific literature now that shows that certain forms of meditation, including both mindfulness and loving kindness and compassion, both can be really helpful in reducing some of the symptoms of depression.
Wow. So can we shift to talking collectively again just a minute? Because that experience of meditating all together, I mean, I don't know what other people felt or what you did, but for me there was a moment when I noticed it wasn't just that everything went suddenly a level quieter even than it had been. There was some moment where it almost felt like everybody's breathing was in sync. I don't know if it was, but what is that? Do you feel like humans can tune themselves almost like an orchestra?
Yeah, definitely. And there are people who are starting to study that now, a kind of interpersonal synchrony. There could be a collective synchrony with more than just a dyad. And so I think that there's certainly all kinds of interesting possibilities that can be explored. It may well be that when we're in a group like this and really settling, that there is some synchrony that does arise as a part of the group. And it's kind of like, it's the image that I have, the metaphor is birds when they're flocking together.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And there's something in the whole that is clearly more than the sum of its parts.
And then I think when they fly in those incredible patterns, maybe we could learn to do that as humans. But I mean, I'm also thinking, of course, it makes sense. I mean, this practice is not unlike prayer or many kinds of practices that have been part of human culture as long as we know. And, you're talking about we might speculate that something could happen if a group meditates together, but people have been praying together and in small groups for millennia. So it seems like it's something we always knew, but our current lifestyle has kind of eroded it.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that as I've been traveling around the world, particularly over the last decade, there's just an increasing hunger for a longing for this kind of quality to be brought back into daily life. And I think that for a variety of reasons, our modern culture is so externally oriented. And technology has certainly, I think, played a role in this, that's made it more difficult for us to be with our own minds in this way. And yet, once people taste it, they recognize what they're missing and I think can appreciate its importance.
It's interesting, the UK just named a first minister of loneliness.
Yeah.
Loneliness is such an epidemic, such a social ill.
Yeah, and it's too bad they named it the Minister of Loneliness. I just got back a couple of weeks ago from Dubai, and in the United Arab Emirates, there's a Minister of Happiness and Well-Being.
That's much better.
So I think, rather than looking at people and trying to notice what's wrong with them, let's look at people and notice what's right with them.
I was reading something recently, maybe it was in your book, sorry, a definition of loneliness. It was sort of the way the term loneliness has evolved over time. Like originally, the very word lonely meant separate physically, geographically from other people. And then it evolved into feeling mentally, emotionally separate. And now I think a lot of people we all know the feeling of being surrounded by other people, but feeling lonely inside. Meditation seems like such a solitary kind of thing. Can it help you feel more connected to other people, less lonely?
I think it can, and as we all experienced, it's often practiced in groups. It's often taught in groups, and so while there certainly can be a solitary component, really what the practice is about is transforming everyday life. And so it's not about the particular experience you might have when you're on a cushion or sitting in a chair. Again, that would be like a state, a drug. Well, that's not what it's about. It's really about how it infiltrates every nook and cranny of your everyday life. That really is what it's about. And so in that sense, it ultimately has to be about connecting with others.
Well, I think these days an awful lot of us feel very concerned about the state of American culture. I know a lot of people feel much more stressed. You've talked with, I think, the former Surgeon General of the United States, Vivek Murthy, who says that he thinks our entire culture is suffering from higher levels of stress. I don't know, who feels more stressed this year than a year or two ago? Yeah. So it feels like your work is more crucial than ever. I don't know, how do you think you could, do you feel like what you're doing has a role to play in changing our culture and healing all of us right now, in this moment?
I think it does, and I think that I feel more fire in the belly to do the work we're doing now than ever before because of what's happening. One of the things that we know is that fear contracts awareness, and we're living in a country where there are masters of the elicitation of fear.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that is important is that we equip ourselves with whatever resources and nurture the resources that we're naturally endowed with to help us not be hijacked by the kind of fear that may be out there.
Explain that as a scientist. Like, what do you want us to know and understand about fear, how it comes into us, attacks us, what it does, and how to resist it? Sorry, that's a really big question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Fear quite literally does narrow awareness so that you are only aware of a very restricted range of the available information in the field around you. And so it's inherently biasing because you end up focusing in one very restricted range. And so the extent to which we can nurture qualities in ourselves that allow us not to be as susceptible to these triggers can be enormously helpful in navigating the modern landscape.
So are you suggesting that when we feel fear, we tend to think more simplistically? Do we slip into, binary, good, bad, in, out kind of thinking?
Yeah, we rely on habitual heuristics for perceiving and decision making that are based upon much more limited information.
I'm just curious and feeling torn thinking about my profession as a journalist, because I think the news media has contributed enormously in the past year, especially, to the general depressing of America. And at the same time, we all carry cell phones with us and we're constantly checking the news, and it makes us unhappy. And here I am making everybody unhappy. I try not to. But I'm just curious, some people would suggest a news diet or a news fast, just pull back from it. I don't know, if somebody said, Richie, you get to be editor of CNN for the next month. Is there anything we could do to change the kinds of stories we tell in the news?
Well, I think when you reflect on daily life, for most middle-class people, at least in America, most of the time, our daily life is infused with positive interactions. We have lots of mini expressions of gratitude, of appreciation, and this is really the stuff of everyday life, and it happens so often that we habituate to it, and the acts of violence or terrorism are shocking and infrequent, and so they are attention grabbers. And so the news media likes to highlight them because of their attention-getting value.
Wow, so it's built into the structure of news. What's new often is something that's bad because, I mean, the good news is that means that most things are pretty good.
Yeah, and so I know that there are some people in journalism that are trying to have channels which celebrate acts of generosity and other virtues that may be more everyday, but we simply are not paying that much attention to it. But I think this is really part of a kind of personal mental hygiene that is involved in the promotion of well-being. All of us have learned to brush our teeth a few times a day. We can learn a simple kind of personal mental hygiene, like our physical hygiene, to remind ourselves to pay attention to the good. And it's really just about reminding ourselves. There are simple things we can do to do that, but it takes practice. And when we start to do that, it's amazing how little intervention of that sort it takes to really shift the kind of emotional balance that a person has.
When you say simple things, are you talking about a meditation practice or something else?
It's not really a meditation practice. It's simply reminding oneself to express appreciation where appreciation is due, to notice when people are thanking us. I mean, really simple things, but we just don't notice it because it happens routinely. And if we paid a little bit more explicit attention to it, brought awareness to it, it can change our demeanor.
Doesn't it seem sort of unfair that it should take so much work to achieve that kind of mental hygiene, to use our minds well?
Well, I actually don't think it takes a lot of work. I think that this is in part a scientific question that we don't know the answer to. But it may not take a lot of work. It may just take regularity. And so, it doesn't take a lot of work to brush our teeth a couple of times a day. And if we spent just that amount of time reminding ourselves, maybe things would be different. We actually don't know the answer to that. But one of the things we often do is when people tell us that they can't possibly spend any extra time each day meditating or cultivating their well-being, we'll say to a person, well, you pick the smallest amount of time that you think you can practice and do it every single day for 30 days, even if it's just 1 minute a day, but do it for 30 consecutive days. And see what happens. It's an invitation.
So I want to talk about your vision of where this might go, because over the course of our lifetimes, we've seen meditation and mental hygiene, emotional well-being go from being, I guess the analogy I like is the fitness revolution. I remember when people first started jogging and they seemed crazy. And now everybody has a gym membership. Do you think the same thing is going to happen with emotional well-being and meditation?
I do, because when people begin to appreciate what can change in their brain with these very simple strategies of care. And the brain is our most precious organ, and we treat it so inappropriately as a culture. We really do. And when this knowledge becomes more widespread and really infiltrates the culture, I do believe, and I've been saying that I believe by 2030, simple practices of mental hygiene will become as commonly incorporated into one's weekly routine as physical exercise is today.
So play that out. What might that look like in schools?
Well, we're seeing it happen in schools already. We're doing a lot of work here in Madison, in the Madison Metropolitan School District, and some other districts in Dane County. And we're collaborating with a wonderful group now in Mexico, where we are training 60,000 school teachers in Mexico to really change the whole educational system in Mexico. This is funded by the Ministry of Education in Mexico. And it's happening in many other parts of the world. Kids are being taught simple skills that we think of as to help them with human flourishing. And one of those skills is attention. And, you know, William James, in one of my most favorite quotes in psychology, he wrote a book in 1890, The Principles of Psychology, and he has a whole chapter on attention. And he said that the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. And he went on to say that an education which can improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. Now, in order to learn, we need to attend. Recent data indicate that the average American adult spends 47% of her or his waking life not paying attention to what they're doing. 47% of the time. Folks, I know we could do better. And even if we made just, say, a 5% increment in that, just imagine the increase in productivity and the decrease in costs that would accrue from that. And with kids, you know, we need to bring this into every classroom in America.
You know, I'm trying to think how, I mean, just selfishly, how my life might have been different if somebody had taught me how to meditate in kindergarten. And then I'm also thinking about...
And we're starting in preschool now.
Wow. Wow. Have you been doing it long enough to see any results?
You know, we've done short-term randomized controlled trials, but we do not have data on long-term effects. Mm-hmm. And my own intuition is that the effects are not going to last unless kids continue to practice in some way. You know, and there's nothing magic about this. We all know that if we go to the gym for a few weeks and really notice some changes in our body and then stop exercising, it's not going to persist. And the same thing with mental exercise.
Okay, what about in the doctor's office? Do you imagine in the next 20 years when you go to the doctor for your annual checkup, she's just as likely to ask you about your mental hygiene as about your physical fitness?
I'm sure that will occur, and I also think that information about our mental well-being will be provided to us in very unusual ways in the future through technology. And so we are now working with digital technology to measure attributes of well-being and do it at scale. And eventually we believe that it will be possible to get information about one's own well-being simply from the data that exists in your smartphone.
Somehow I think we've heard this before from Facebook. The others.
It's fraught with
Facebook for the good.
It's fraught with complexity, but I think it's going to happen, and I think that we're not going to get rid of this technology. And so, one of the important invitations and challenges is to explore how we can use it for constructive purposes and to promote well-being, which is something that we're very interested in doing.
Well, I've really been wondering about that lately, because as we've seen, you know, the Russian bot farms spread fear throughout our social networks and our news media, I've wondered, rather than just trying to restrict that, I mean, can't somebody wealthy like Bill Gates just fund emotional well-being bot farm that just puts things out that will make us feel better? And what would that even look like? How could you use our powerful digital technology to increase emotional well-being?
I mean, at the very least, we can use it to remind people to check in with themselves, remind people to notice what may be virtuous, to engage in simple practices to settle their mind if they're agitated. There are many, many ways of doing this. I just was at a meeting in Silicon Valley, a small meeting that was convened with executives from some of the largest tech corporations and a few scientists. And the focus of the meeting was, how can we make technology more compassionate? And I mean, some of the stuff that we talked about was a little crazy, like, how can we make Alexa more compassionate?
She says, "Good morning, you look great."
But, one of the things we were shown are data about how many times Alexa is asked, for example, how can I commit suicide?
People ask Alexa that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So there's some serious issues which these tech companies are having to confront now, and they have no idea how to address this.
Alexa should call a suicide prevention hotline immediately.
Well, and it doesn't right now. So these are some of the issues that we're going to all be collectively facing with the kind of technology that's now available.
But I like the idea of figuring out ways we can humanize the technology and use it for good and for compassion, rather than just letting it go where it's going to go.
Absolutely.
Anyway, we have questions from the audience. I don't get to ask everything. So let's see. This is a wonderful one. My mom had a stroke a few years ago. How can I help her find happiness in the face of what she's lost? She's still cognitively good, but she lost the left side of her body and requires 24-hour care, and she used to be very active.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And, I think in situations like that, simply providing love is probably the most important thing. There's a very famous spiritual teacher, some of you may have heard of, named Ram Dass. Used to be Richard Alpert, who was a former professor of psychology at Harvard, then took LSD for a while, and then discovered meditation. He's now in his late 70s, I believe, and about 15 years ago, he had a serious stroke.
Yeah.
And it's been really interesting to see how he's adapted to it, and really resting in just this tremendous gratitude to be alive, and to appreciate what he does have, and not to get fixated on the things that he's lost. And in fact, certain of the things he's lost, he celebrates. He liked to do some things that were stumbling upon happiness, that really weren't contributing to his well-being, and he can't do those things anymore. And he now recognizes that this is a blessing. And so it's complicated and difficult, but if we still have the capacity for awareness, we have the capacity for well-being.
Well, this is something we'll all encounter as we age, and I feel like we're on the cusp of a revolution in the way we think about aging, rather than thinking of it as a loss of faculties or a diminution of memory and other things, to begin looking at the elder brain and the wise mind as we age. And I do feel like that's something that's happening too.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we see in normative research on aging is that people do change their priorities, and that actually helps to improve their well-being. And in general, we see in the 6th and 7th and 8th decades of life an increase in well-being normatively. And it's really because of this recalibration of priorities.
Do you think it's because, by the time you've lived into if you're lucky enough to live into your 60s or 70s or 80s, life has forced you to live some resilience, and so you've achieved. You can't stop bad things from happening, but you have had a lot of experience in bouncing back.
I think that's really important, and it is, your intuition is exactly right, and that to express resilience, to have resilience, requires that you've encountered adversity.
But that's a way of reframing old age.
Yes.
It all has to do with the story we tell, going back to you talking about the narrative. So are you telling the story of aging as a story of loss, or are you telling it as a story of gain? You've gained equanimity and resilience.
Yes, absolutely.
Another question. Dr. Davidson, please share, this is lovely, what is the most precious thing you have learned from His Holiness the Dalai Lama? I'll try to answer the question and then also tell a little story. The most precious thing I've learned is I've seen him in so many different situations over the last 25 years, and at one of his 80th birthday parties, he's now 82, there was a birthday party in New York City, a small event with about 40 people, not more than that, people who knew him quite well, and included among those were a number of very famous people like Richard Gere and Dianne Feinstein, the senator from California. And the Dalai Lama treated them the exact same way he treated the security people and the janitorial staff in the hotel in which this was held. Absolutely no different. He treats every human being with the same quality of respect and compassion. And that's really remarkable to see that in action. So another little story, I was once with the Dalai Lama at his residence in Dharamsala, India. This was a number of years ago, and I was with a Japanese scientist who I had just met the day before, an unusual guy. And at one point, it was just the three of us, myself, this Japanese scientist, and the Dalai Lama, in a room together alone, which doesn't happen that often like that. And at one point, this Japanese scientist leaned over and said, "Your Holiness, can you please tell us about the time in your life when you were the most happy, apropos of this evening?" And I thought, wow, that's an interesting question. What might he say? Just like that, he said, "I think right now." That's really lovely. I like the story you tell about him in your book. You mentioned you were there once when he'd heard about something terrible happening to some people, and tears began rolling down his face. And you said, like 2 minutes later, somebody said something funny, and he was laughing uproariously. That just sort of going. Anyway,
yes, and that's one of the qualities of his emotion, is that there is no stickiness. He can go from crying to laughing just like that. We see that in young infants.
Yeah.
But it's a quality that we lose as adults. And he has absolutely no stickiness. He can just go from one extreme to the other, but it's very context appropriate, and it's imbued with wisdom.
It's kind of hard to imagine that in somebody who also has a very developed intellectual ability. I can imagine it in a baby. And somehow when you talk about a person having that ability, I imagine a person being sort of like a child, like Donald Trump. I shouldn't have said that. I didn't say that. But it's not just a complete simplistic innocence. It's a
No.
very deep innocence somehow.
It is, and it does have childlike qualities, and he's very playful. My wife and I were together in Dharamsala just last week, and he loves to make fun of my nose and talks about how I have a big nose, and that the two, my wife and I together, have big noses, although mine is bigger, he says. So, it's just playfulness.
What does he think about what's happened in America these days? He's
Really, really saddened by it. Really saddened. And it's weighing on him very much. He used to love to come to America. He has had really great relationships with virtually every American president since he's been in exile. But now is very different. So I'm not sure what's going to happen, but he has very little interest in coming to America right now.
What would he, do you think, suggest to all of us? What would he suggest we could do if we would like to change the tone and the feeling in America today?
Well, I think one really important thing is that the Dalai Lama is an activist, but he's an activist with love and with compassion. And, one of the people in the U.S. Congress that I think embodies that same quality is John Lewis, the congressman from Georgia who is now in his 80s and was very prominent in the civil rights movement. I've met him, and he doesn't have any anger. He is motivated by love. And so I think that we can learn a lot, and I think we can become much more powerful in our activism if we're able to get past the anger.
Tell me how to do that or what that looks like. Let's say I've picked up the paper and somebody, a national figure, is doing something I think is terrible and will hurt people, and I'm furious.
And it happens to me too.
No, not
all
you.
the time. But I try to let go of it as quickly as I can and realize that it's ultimately not going to be helpful, I think, in promoting the deep kind of change that I think our nation needs. We need to be able to talk to people across the spectrum and to understand that if people are saying things which we think are destructive, it's really because they're confused and deluded. It's not necessarily, I don't think it's because they're malicious, for the most part. So I think that, and this requires practice. When Martin Luther King was doing what he was doing, first of all, the speech that Martin Luther King gave was not, "I have a nightmare."
Yeah.
And so, we need to hold out what that positive vision is. And we need to embody it to powerfully communicate it.
And I'm thinking about, 1 million school children walked out last week all around the country to protest gun violence. That was a wonderful thing for them to do. How could you pivot the message from anger about gun violence?
Well, I think that it's possible, and I think that reflecting on it in this kind of way and understanding that people who are on the opposite side, are not necessarily saying what they're saying for malicious purposes. It's just that they're totally confused, and I think that we can be much more effective if we come at this not from a stance of anger.
Somebody on our show said the other day, it was two people talking about racism, and said, you can hate racism or you can protest racism, but not racists. That was at least a beginning, but I still, it's still talking about opposing something. I'd like to imagine how you could change that. I guess just a message of love. So let's have another one. What data is available to measure the meditation effects in populations? Basically, how is happiness measured? And in particular, what measures are available related to meditation?
Well, some of you may know that for the last several years, under the auspices of the United Nations, there is a report that's been issued, written mostly by economists, called the World Happiness Report. And it tracks data from many different countries on the collective state of happiness in different nations.
New one just came out last week.
Yeah, a few weeks ago. And the measures that they use there, we think of as measures that are not so good. They basically ask people on a questionnaire, essentially, how happy are you on a 7-point scale? There are a few questions that are worded in different ways, but they're essentially asking the same thing. We are really interested in our own center in developing ways of measuring well-being at scale using much more solid, scientifically grounded strategies.
How would you do that? And what questions would you ask?
We're going to do things that are not just about asking questions. That's what we're doing. And so part of it is getting data that psychologists call experience sampling, where we query people in the moment. So we, for example, text them and we ask them, at this instant, how are you feeling? For those of you who have an iPhone 10, you know that every time you open your phone, the phone is capturing a snapshot of your facial expression.
It is?
It is. And so it may be possible, we don't know this yet, but it may be possible to actually use that as data that you can aggregate across time. There are many other ways, but this is a big project that is not something that we're going to solve in a year or two, but we are devoting an enormous amount of resources now in our center to developing a mobile platform that will enable us to measure well-being at scale. And we intend to have this translated into a number of different languages, and it's part of a whole initiative to cultivate well-being at scale. So there's a measurement piece to it, but there's also a piece that will involve a very comprehensive program to cultivate well-being that will initially disseminate to organizations.
That 2018 World Happiness Report that came out recently, I noticed that the U.S. dropped 4 more points. We're now fairly low down compared to other nations that are comparatively wealthy. If you had to guess, using your preferred form of measurement, how do you think the U.S. would stack up against the other similar nations?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm not sure. I suspect that our kind of measures will be more conservative in that they will actually indicate even less well-being than the self-report measures convey.
That could be true. And I mean, everybody could drop. Like those people in Finland and Scandinavia, they could be less happy too.
Yeah, that's true.
Damn them. They're always so happy. Okay, so now that I've offended everybody,
You're doing great.
Can art making be a meditative practice? Can it be a practice toward loving kindness and compassion?
You know, I think it could be. Whether it typically is or not, I'm not sure. One of the things that we did at the very beginning of the little meditation practice that we did together is we collectively invoke the intention that we're doing this practice not only for ourselves, but for the benefit of others. And I can't overestimate how important the invocation of this altruistic motivation is. And we believe that this may be as, if not more important than the actual practice itself. And so when we do art, when we play a musical instrument, or for that matter, I often am asked the same question about going out for a run. People tell me, running is my meditation. Well, do you say to yourself when you go out to run, I'm running now so that I can get my body in shape and have energy so that I can better serve others? You could do that. And my guess, from everything I know about the science, is that it will have a different impact if you do that consistently. Just that simple shift. And so we don't normally do those kinds of activities and do it with this kind of altruistic intention, but we could. And I can envision the development of a kind of contemplative arts where this is done, and also contemplative aerobics, which I've been promoting.
Contemplative aerobics. Well, what about, aren't there already some of those practices? I'm thinking about Tibetan sand painting or
Yes,
mandalas or something.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, there are sacred art practices. Does the happy in us stay with us throughout life, no matter the struggles?
I think that it does, but we often can't find it. And it's the same as basic awareness. There's a quality of basic awareness which is with us all the time, but we often don't notice it because we're not accustomed to interrogating our own minds. But I think in terms of happiness, there's always this basic goodness which has to do with happiness that is with us all the time. But we don't tune into it a lot of the time. And so part of this whole invitation is to really tune into this. When we do these practices on loving kindness and compassion, we're not creating something de novo, but rather we are tapping into something that's already there, I believe, and simply nurturing it.
That's really lovely. I was just doing an interview with somebody who was talking about an experience of, well, she was talking about getting over depression, and we were talking about medication, and she said she came to think of the medication, which had at first helped her and later didn't, as a form of psychoactive Drano, in the sense that she felt that it simply removed all of the sludge that was the mental and emotional sludge that covered up who she really was, that her real self was there all along. It sounds like that you're suggesting meditation can do the same thing.
Yes, absolutely.
What makes you think that humans are innately good? I mean, I know you've done studies even with infants or small children, or there have been those studies, right?
Yeah, so there's that. I mean, there are, I don't know how many people are here, but there's a crowd coming for a talk on happiness. How many of you would show up for a talk to learn how to become more angry? I mean, it's kind of obvious that, and it's puzzling to me that this is so mysterious.
It must drive you crazy when evolutionary biologists and reporters say, what do you mean? What makes you think humans are innately good?
And you know, Steve Pinker wrote a book recently on the history of violence in the human race. And actually, Bill Gates has said that is the most important book he's read in the last 25 years. And it documents very, very Talmudically the systematic decline in violence. And we are at the lowest point in human history in the expression of violence right now. I know that many of you find that hard to believe. But in fact, that's true. Those are what the data show. And, you know, it used to be that when two people had an argument, it was adjudicated by a duel. That pretty much doesn't happen anymore. And so, so there's that too. So I think there's just a lot of evidence, but we don't really pay much attention to it.
I want to end by asking you something more personal about your own experience as a lifetime meditator. I guess I'm really curious about what you feel like you've learned and experienced yourself over time about what maybe we could call the deep nature of mind. Do you feel like your awareness has changed, expanded? Have you arrived at a place where there are, things you've realized about the self, the mind, the soul that you couldn't have understood earlier?
Well, I would say that, first of all, despite the fact that I've been meditating for a long time, I attended my first meditation retreat in 1974 and have been meditating ever since. I still consider myself very much a beginner. And what I would say is that I've gotten certain glimpses of this basic quality of awareness, which is something that I think is sort of present across the universe in all of us. And it is, in some sense, on the one hand, so common that we don't recognize it. And it takes practice to recognize it, because it is so pervasive. But when you tap into it, it gives you a deep appreciation, I think, for the preciousness of human life. And I think we all, as human beings, have an extraordinary opportunity. We are the only species, to the best of our knowledge, who can transform our minds and who can actually intentionally recognize this basic quality of awareness, which is so important and unique. And so it's a kind of humbling experience to recognize this. And I think that when more people appreciate this, it will really change how we relate to one another.
Are you saying that you think that our awareness is not just inside our heads?
Let's put it this way. One of the things that I try to do as a scientist, and it's hard, and I don't always do it well, but I try to practice humility about how much we don't know. And there's a knee-jerk reaction in science, particularly in the biological sciences, that we basically have figured it all out. And what remains is, there's still a lot that remains, but the fundamental understanding of life we kind of get. And I don't believe that for a moment.
So there could be a whole new Copernican revolution, or the equivalent of Darwin discovering evolution, in terms of awareness and the nature of mind, and whether we're all just inside here or whether we're all connected and swimming in something larger.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that it's important to resist the forces which want to prematurely close our accounts with reality.
I love it so much that you're saying that as a trained scientist. It makes me deeply happy. So, to circle back around. Richie, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for being a wonderful audience.
Thank you very much. That was great.